Welcome back, guys. Today's episode, I am sharing 10 most disturbing true Alaskan encounter horror stories. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Name's Jack Durant. Been working the Alaskan backcountry my whole life. Hauling gear, running bush routes, guiding folks who think they're tough until the cold teaches them otherwise. Winters out here are something you don't just survive. You wrestle them, every mile a fist fight with the elements. That's why when I say I know the land, I mean it. It doesn't just brush against you, it leaves scars. Back in 2004, I agreed to help 2 surveyors catalog old claim sites scattered in the Talkeetna Mountains for a mapping project. They were young, college boys out of Fairbanks, brimming with the kind of arrogance that only people new to danger carry. Their boots were shiny, their packs squeaked when they adjusted the straps, and they had that look in their eyes, the adventure look. I knew then they weren't ready for the things you can't plan for. We spent 2 days trudging through knee-deep snow, silence only broken by the chewing of our crampons and the strained huffs of our breath. On the 3rd day, late afternoon, we found it. A scattering of collapsed cabins half buried in drifts, an open mouth of a mine yawning black against the mountain wall. It was the sort of place that history doesn't erase, it just abandons. And from the first second, I hated it. The wind didn't whistle like it should have. Instead, it seemed sucked into that shaft, pulled down into the dark with a sound like a long exhale. The air was sharp, dense, carrying a bitter bite past normal cold. I felt frost down to my bones before, but this was different, like standing in front of a freezer filled with something rancid, something that shouldn't still be there. Of course, the kids lit up like it was their birthday. Cameras flashed, jokes cracked, and one even shouted into the mine, getting nothing but an echo that came back delayed, warped, almost as if another voice had joined it. He laughed nervously, brushing it off. I didn't. We pitched camp 50 yards off. That night the wind shifted, and I heard something I'll never forget. At first, I thought it was the groaning of the timbers that still rimmed the shaft. But it wasn't wood. It was a low moan. Not animal and not human, at least not anymore. When the boys heard it too, one whispered, "Who else is out here?" I wanted to lie, to put their nerves at ease. But the truth sat heavy on my tongue. There shouldn't have been anyone. Not there, not in that weather, not in those ruins. Around the fire that night the smell came. Metallic, sour, like copper left in a jar of stagnant water. The boys stopped joking. One wrapped his scarf higher over his face. I fought the urge to gag because my instincts told me that smell wasn't traveling on the wind. It was spilling out of the mine along with that heavy chill. Then came the crunching. Boots, or something that sounded like boots, in the snow near the shaft. Deliberate, slow, crunch, pause, crunch. My hand slid to the rifle at my side while I squinted toward the dark. At first, I convinced myself it had to be another prospector. Maybe some hermit eking out a life scavenging ruins. Except every sensible part of me knew nobody wintered out there. Nobody. And then I saw him. At the edge of the firelight he stood, tall but slumped, shoulders stooped like he was carrying loads too heavy to ever set down. His clothes were ragged, dark shapes drooping against the white snow, but his face, Christ, his face, it was too pale, like it had been washed in flour, and the eyes were wrong, hollow, unfocused, like they were looking both through us and behind us at once. One of the boys gasped, "Holy hell, someone's here." The other, braver or dumber, snapped a photo with his flash camera. The burst of light blinded me for a heartbeat that stretched too long. When my sight cleared, the man was gone. Just shadows bunching around the mine, dancing with the wind. No footprints, no sign he'd ever been standing there at all. The kids asked me if I'd seen him. My throat was dry as tinder when I said yes. I didn't bother sugarcoating the truth. That wasn't right. That wasn't a man. We didn't sleep after that. Between gusts of cruel wind, the silence filled with things no forest or mountain should make. Rough voices, angry voices. I swear on my father's grave I heard coughing fits. men spitting oaths about stolen gold, boots clashing on frozen rock. It was a chorus of the damned echoing from that shaft. At 3 in the morning, our fire sputtered to embers. The wind paused, just enough silence for us to hear the mine begin to scream. Don't ask me how stone and ice can make a sound like that, but it can, because I heard it. The mine exhaled like a beast, belching a gust of freezing air that cut through our tent, knocked it flat, and stunned us where we kneeled in the snow. The ground itself seemed to stir beneath my knees. That's when I saw the hands, blackened, cracked fingers jutting through the snow like weeds, scrabbling at our boots, tugging, pulling. Not fully formed bodies, just fragments like the mountain only let the worst part of them crawl free. Their nails shredded, skin splitting under the frost. One hand latched onto the cuff of my pants, and I felt the burn of cold sear through me like a brand. The boys screamed, thrashing, kicking until the hands retracted, vanishing as suddenly as they emerged. The mine let loose another howl, deeper this time like the voices of dozens all compressed into one. We ran. No plan, no thought, only blind terror pumped into our legs. One of the boys dropped his pack. Inside it was the camera. He begged me to go back, but I saw those pale fingers in my mind and said, "No, leave it." We didn't stop until dawn. We stumbled into a ranger station, frostbitten, shaking. The rangers laughed when we tried to explain, said hypothermia causes hallucinations, said exposure makes men imagine things. But all three of us had the same screams carved into our skulls, the same figure burnt into our memory, gaunt-faced and silent at the mine's mouth. A few weeks later, I got an email from one of the boys. Attached was a single photo. Out of the dozens they'd shot, only one had uploaded before the pack was lost. In it, the mine sagged in the background, edges blurred by snowfall. And in the right-hand corner, caught mid-scream, was a chalk-white face, twisted, jaw unhinged, eyes empty as the Alaskan winter sky. The surveyors never worked the field again. I haven't stepped near the Tahkeetnas since, but sometimes, when the snow outside my cabin shifts in the dead of night, I swear I hear that laughter again. Clogging, wheezing, choking laughter clawing at the dark. Here's what I learned that night. Alaska doesn't abandon her dead. She lets them keep working, scratching forever in the frozen dark, angry at the living who dare come to look. My name's Raymond Ellison. Folks just call me Ray. I worked as a seasonal ranger up around Hatcher's Pass during the early 90s and into the 2000s, mostly guiding trekkers, checking cabins, making sure folks didn't get themselves killed by doing something stupid in avalanche country. I've always respected the mountains. See, out here, nature teaches you quick. She doesn't whisper. She slaps you in the teeth. But what I ran into one bleak autumn wasn't nature. It was something older, something still clinging to the bones of this land long past when it should have let go. I was making a patrol in late September, a time when the gold rush remnants seem to sigh a little louder in the wind. The foliage dies back, cabins settle deeper into the rot, and the nights stretch like long shadows. I'd been out solo for 3 days. On my 4th, I came across one of those half-forgotten sites, an abandoned prospectors' camp with 3 half-collapsed shacks, their roofs sagging like broken backs under decades of snow load. Off to one side was an old shaft, framed with warped timbers, filled halfway with rocks from a cave-in. The place had that look about it, as if the earth had gobbled it down whole and was still chewing. There was something strange, though. In the window of the least damaged shack, a light flickered. Just a faint, steady glow. At first I figured poachers, squatters, or even a lost hiker. My job was to check, so I trudged over. But when I stepped inside the cabin, it was empty, not just empty, vacant to its bones. Dust thick enough to track footprints in. Spider webs clinging like curtains to the corners. No sleeping bag, no rucksack, no human presence. And yet on the table in the corner sat an old mining lantern. Glass cracked. Handle rusted stiff, burning with the soft flutter of orange flame. I froze. Lanterns like that don't light themselves. And even if some idiot had lit it and left, the wick should have been bone dry decades ago. I backed out slowly, my boots crunching on old wood and in the dead silence of the valley. The only sound was the hiss-pop of that lantern, flame. That's when I realized there wasn't a single footprint in the dust or snow. Except my own. I considered smashing the lantern, snuffing it out and chalking it up as a good spooky story for campfires. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My gut told me it wasn't mine to meddle with. So instead I made camp not far off, figuring I'd watch, make sure no squatters or vagrants crept in after dark. The woods went silent in that unnatural way, like when a predator's near. No owls, no rustle of tiny feet in the brush. Just the beat of my heart echoing inside my ears while I stared at that cursed shack with its warm, flickering glow. Around midnight, the lantern light wavered. It grew brighter, sharper, as if someone had just pumped fresh air into its chamber. I sat up, rifle across my knees, and that's when I heard the crunch of boots. Heavy, dragging, coming from inside the mine shaft. Out staggered a figure, no mistake about it. A man, or what used to be one. He was tall, gaunt, wrapped in tattered flannel and suspenders, his beard blackened with grime. At first I thought maybe some hermit had been living in the shaft. But then he turned his head toward me, and everything in me revolted. Skin pale as wax, eyes like burned-out sockets, lips cracked open in a half-snarl, half-smile that never shifted. He clutched something in one filthy hand, another lantern. Exactly like the one sitting in the shack, except this one was unlit. He shuffled forward, boots grinding in the frost, heading straight for that little cabin like it was the only road left in the world. I ducked low, breath steaming in the night air, certain he'd seen me. But he didn't glance my way. He shuffled inside, the glow in the shack flaring bright as the two lanterns touched. And then the flame rose blue, a blue so sharp it bent the shadows on the snow. From inside came a cough, dry and rattling, joined by another, then another, until it sounded like a whole camp of men racked with sickness, laughing and arguing in the same breath. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused. I sat rooted, listening, eyes locked on that spectral radiance burning where no fire should. When dawn came, the voices ceased. Morning light washed the valley gray. The lantern still burned, weak and orange again, the way it had before. I could have left it. Could have walked back down the pass and told myself the altitude, the silence, and the loneliness had tricked me. But the ranger code is drilled into me. Leave no hazard behind. And a constantly burning flame in a brittle wooden shack? That was a hazard, ghost or no ghost. So, against my better judgment, I stepped inside at first light. The lantern sat there, flickering low. I reached for it, jerking when the heat singed my fingers. That's what chilled me the most. It was hot. It wasn't some illusion. This dead, impossible relic was alive. I lifted it, carried it out of the shack. The moment I crossed the threshold, the voices burst back to life. They rose on the wind out of the shaft behind me, men shouting about stolen claims, fighting over gold, roaring in coughs and curses. The snow trembled like boot heels striking the earth beneath it. Then, clear above the noise, a single voice boomed, "Put it back!" I staggered, clutching that burning lantern. The light flared, then shrank, as if begging me to obey. I don't remember dropping it, but I must have because suddenly it was lying in the snow. Fire snuffed out as though water had doused it. Silence fell instantly. When I lifted my head, the figure stood at the mine's edge again. Silent, sun glaring off empty eyes. His unlit lantern swung loosely in his hand. I didn't stick around. I grabbed my pack and made tracks down the mountain, but here's the part that eats at me. A week later, hiking a different trail, far from Hatcher's Pass, I stopped for water by a creek. When I set down my canteen, there it was, on a stump across from me, sitting like it had just been placed there, that same cracked glass lantern, flickering with a weak, defiant flame. No footprints led to or from it. No smell of oil. No explanation. Just that same impossible light, daring me to touch it again. I keep wondering if I carry it with me now, whether I walked away from the valley or if part of it came with me. Sometimes, nights in my cabin, I'll see a faint orange glow down the hall where no lamp burns. and I feel the weight of all those coughing voices pressing in. I'll tell you this, and you had better believe me. Some lanterns in Alaska will never go out, and if you try to carry their light, it'll follow you long after you're gone. Name's Samuel Sam Kropnick. I worked heavy equipment most of my life. Dredges, loaders, haul trucks, and the ugly monsters that chew earth for a living. In the early 90s, I ended up in Fairbanks on contract jobs, and one winter, a side gig fell into my lap. I got paid to keep an eye on an old dredge site that had shut down long before. Not for gold. No, this rig was a backed-up carcass, a rotting skeleton of steel sticking half-frozen into the black soil of an abandoned claim. Folks in town called it Number 6 because the Alaska Gold Company had over a dozen of them chewing up creeks in their heyday, but Number 6 hadn't run since the 40s, when the veins ran dry and the war pulled men away. By the time I saw her, she sat crooked on the permafrost. Her buckets collapsed, deck half-rotted but still monolithic, like some massive rusted coffin frozen mid-step. Most people wouldn't volunteer to babysit such a place in winter. But it was easy money back then, and I thought the idea of sitting inside a dead dredge overnight sounded more boring than dangerous. My job, keep vandals out, keep drunks from burning it down, things like that. But when I first stepped into her steel belly that November, I realized how far gone she was. Every step echoed. Rust flakes fell like snow from girders above. Chains clinked lazily as if moved by unseen fingers. The machinery smelled like it still remembered oil, though none should have been there in 50 years. Day shifts were fine. Quiet. You could almost convince yourself Number 6 was nothing but history. But come night, something stirred. The first evening, I set up a cot in what used to be the operator's cabin. Windows shattered long ago, the control levers seized in place like frozen bones. Around midnight, when the cold hit hardest, I woke to a faint grinding sound. At first, I thought it was wind gnawing at the hull, but then I realized it had rhythm, slow and deliberate. A chain dragging, buckets clattering one after another. I sat up, ears straining, and felt my chest seize. Those dredge chains were moving. Not fast, not fully engaged, but clanging with a steady cadence like some invisible giant had just fired the place back up. The sound faded after 5 minutes. I laughed it off, called it metal settling against the freeze, but the laugh caught in my throat when, just before dawn, I smelled it. Wet earth and diesel smoke, a mixture that couldn't exist here anymore, not unless the dredge had decided the work wasn't finished. By the third night, I wasn't laughing anymore. I told my supervisor I kept hearing things, and he said, "Yeah, everyone does there. That's why I pay you double." He wouldn't explain, and I was too stubborn to quit. This night, I paced the deck instead of bedding down. I brought a flashlight and a flask. Figure I'd stare the noises down until I found their source. Number 6 sat silent under a moon smeared by clouds, black ribs of steel rising against a darker sky. The Fairbanks air stung my teeth with every breath. Around 1 in the morning, it started again. The bucket chain groaned. Not just 1 or 2 rattles. This time it moved with purpose, teeth grinding against the frozen sluice box. My flashlight beam bounced, and I swear I saw one of the giant buckets, rust-scarred and half-collapsed, swing. Not like the wind had nudged it, but like it had weight in it. Then the smell hit again. Diesel heavy in my lungs, sharp tang of engine oil, and under it the reek of wet gravel freshly torn from the creek bed. My gut twisted because that smell didn't belong to my world. It belonged to theirs. And then I heard them. Men's voices, muffled, rising with the clank of chains. Orders shouted, boots striking the narrow decks above me. The dredge vibrated faintly under my feet like steel waking from a long coma. I threw my light across the walkway and froze. Shapes moved there, dark against darker. Bent-backed workers in torn coats and heavy gloves, climbing ladders, hauling unseen loads. Their faces kept sliding in and out of place, blurred as though the dredge itself was trying to remember them. One turned his head and his sockets gaped hollow. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound left his broken jaw. My throat dried. My legs wanted to run, but the stairwell behind me closed up in shadow. I swear it folded in like the dredge was sealing around me. Finally, the operator strode into view, high on the cabin deck, a towering figure, oil slicked, helmet cracked and face lost in shadow. His hands gripped the seized levers, and when he pulled them back, the entire dredge wailed. A shriek of rust over rust. The buckets roared alive, grinding gravel that wasn't there, shaking the frost loose. I heard the waters rushing below, though the creek had been barren for decades. The whole place had gone back to work. I don't remember leaving my spot. One moment I was staring at that blurred army of dead men at their stations. The next, I was crouched in the snow outside, gasping, my flashlight gone. But the strangest part wasn't escaping. It was what I saw once I stumbled 50 yards off and looked back. Number 6 was lit. Not brightly, but dimly. Glowing windows, lantern light bleeding through steel ribs, shadows pacing through its decks as though every station was manned. The bucket chain clattered, teeth grinding, throwing sparks into the night like fireflies. I watched, shivering, until the sounds slowed again, dragging into silence as dawn bruised the sky. One by one, the lights blinked out. The dredge became carcass once more. I didn't tell the boss the full truth when I quit the next morning. I just said the steel was too rotten to keep me safe, that it would collapse. He smirked like he'd expected me to fold eventually. Weeks later, I bumped into an old-timer at a diner outside Fairbanks. We swapped stories, and when I mentioned number 6, his eyes narrowed. He nodded, sipping coffee. Then he said, "Yeah, men died in her. A cave-in crushed the bucket line, kept grinding right over 'em. Machine didn't stop for hours. Caught 6 of 'em, chewed them to pulp before she finally froze solid. They say the dredge never quit in their heads, never shut off their shift." That explanation clamped around my chest like a vice. Even now, years later, in my small Anchorage apartment, I refuse to own a clock with a ticking second hand. The metallic clank takes me right back to that bucket line. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I smell it again. The rot of wet earth, the burn of old diesel, the iron taste of blood mashed into gravel. I've heard folks romanticize the gold rush, its grit, its promise, its brave men. But let me tell you true. There are machines in Alaska still working for gold, even when the earth won't give any. Machines that never learn to stop, dragging their crews along in endless shifts. If you ever camp near Fairbanks, steer clear of the husks of those iron monsters, especially number 6. Because some nights, if the wind is dead still, you can hear it roar awake, and if you're close enough, those dead men might take you on as their next shift worker. Folks call me Richard Lowe, born and raised in Whitehorse, but I spent near 20 years working as a pack guide on the old trails into Alaska. My job wasn't glamorous. Lead mule lines, haul freight, escort wide-eyed adventurers who thought they could handle the same passes prospectors did back in 1898. The worst section was always Dead Horse Gulch, near the Chilkoot Pass. History is written in the snow there. Over 3,000 animals littered that slope during the big rush. Starved, whipped, broken, their bodies piled so thick some men used them like stairs up the trail. People talk about how gold fever pulled men onward even when their packs grew heavier than their morals. You don't forget the look of a place where death was as common as snowflakes. In 2001, late in the season, I had a pair of clients who wanted to experience the ghost of the gold rush. Their words, not mine. Historians, sort of city-bred thrill-seekers. I told them camping in Dead Horse Gulch was about as much fun as sleeping in a graveyard. They laughed, thought I was being superstitious. We set camp just off the old rotted timbers of a cabin that had collapsed 90 years earlier. Wind shrieked straight through the canyon carrying a sour odor. At first, I chalked it up to the naturally decaying carcasses that sometimes surface after heavy snowmelt. Nothing about Dead Horse smells clean. Still, something about that night gnawed at me, in the bones, not the belly. The historians busied themselves with notes and cameras, trying to document historic atmosphere. I sat by the fire chewing jerky when the quiet hit. No wolf calls, no shuffling from our pack animals, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you hear your own veins beat. Then the mules panicked. They screamed low, a guttural bray that told me they'd scented more than predators. The fire flared as a gust slammed down the gulch. In the flickering glow, I saw shapes moving near the rim above us, low, hunched, jerking. For a split second I thought wolves, maybe even a bear. But no. These things crawled wrong, spindly, like ribs and hooves stretched over shadows. The two historians laughed nervously. "Must be snow-blowing debris," they said, but I knew. Those weren't shadows the wind tossed. Those were the gulch's dead, restless in their eternal pile, crawling down to remind us we camped on their bones. I tried to play it calm for the sake of my clients. I told them to stay close to the fire while I moved to check the stock. Our mules were half-crazed, yanking ropes so hard I thought they'd break their necks. Their whites showed stark in the dark. They didn't want to be there, and truth be told, neither did I. I'd just stepped to unfasten a lead knot when a sound cut through the gulch. Not wind, not creak. It was the heaving rasp of a dying horse, or dozens of them, layered over one another, the kind of bray that rattles deep in the gut of a creature whose body is shattering under weight too heavy to carry. The historians heard it too. They froze, eyes wide as the echo rolled around us. Then came a heavier noise, the dragging clomp of hooves across stone, except they weren't solid hoofbeats. They were wet, sticky, like flesh being pulled off bone with every step. The fire bent low against a sudden downdraft of air, and in that moment I saw them clearly. Horses, or the remains of horses. Some staggered on shadows for legs, their hides ripped thin, ribs showing. Others dragged torsos torn from their back ends. A whole herd of these eyeless phantoms trudged into our camp's circle like draft animals still hauling invisible loads. Their heads jerked down as if still harnessed to an eternal freight, their mouths open with black throats screaming silently. One of the historians whimpered, fumbling with his camera. The flash popped and every mule bolted. Ropes snapped like twigs. All four animals tore off into black, panicked shapes swallowed by the canyon pass. The undead herd closed in. I could feel cold radiating off them like winter's fist, dropping the fire's heat into ash. And behind them, the shadows on the rim moved again. Not just horses now, but men. Prospectors. Bent-backed, skeletal. Their eyes glinted with something desperate and angry, their mouths working noiselessly as they staggered behind their dead beasts. Still clawing at phantom reins, I grabbed both clients by the arms, dragging them backward toward the collapsed cabin ruin. The voice in my skull screamed what I didn't want to say out loud. The dead weren't just passing through. They were here to stomp us into the pile. We shoved inside the collapsed cabin's skeleton of logs, pulling wreckage in front of the doorway. Not that I believed wood would keep phantoms out, but desperation makes fences where sense won't. The sounds rose to a crescendo outside. Hooves pounding, chains rattling, men shouting orders through splintered throats. The ground vibrated like a stampede charging right over us. My heart was ready to burst. Both historians clung to each other, their bravado shattered to pieces. Then, the logs above us shifted. Something pressed against the wreckage roof. A fetid ooze dripped down, slick and dark. It smelled like rot and iron. I didn't want to look up, but I did, and saw an eyeless horse's muzzle pressed against a gap in the logs inches from my face. Its skin hung in strips, nostrils torn, teeth bared. It pushed, and the cabin groaned. I roared, shoving the logs harder in front of us. Not out of courage, just blind terror. The muzzle retracted, replaced by pounding hooves on the roof, shaking dirt into our eyes. The historian sobbed. I thought we'd be crushed flat beneath the gulch's vengeful herd. Then, as quickly as it built, the noise faltered. The shouting withered, the herd stumbled, and the sounds dragged back toward the rim. Eventually, nothing but the howl of wind filled the gulch again. We staggered out with dawn. Our animals were gone. No prints, no trace, like they'd been erased. Nearby, snow showed only one thing, deep imprints unlike any I've ever seen. Hooves, dozens of them, punched into the frost. But every track was filled with black water, slick and foul-smelling, too warm to freeze. The historians quit their little project that very day. They left town broken, refusing interviews they once bragged about scheduling, As for me, I never went back to Dead Horse Gulch. The land doesn't forget what was broken there. They whipped those beasts to death 100 years ago, and something in the soil kept them suffering. Now, every fool who camps there risks being drafted into the endless freight line, trampled, dragged, and added to the gulch's tally. When folks ask if ghosts are real, I laugh bitter. Not because I think it's funny, because there's nothing funny about herds without eyes hauling invisible loads forever. Nothing funny about the clatter of phantom hooves at your back when no trail leads out. I'll tell you, for Alaska's dead rush, some camps never closed and some gulches are still hungry. Name's Warren McCabe. Retired now, living quiet in Anchorage, but back in the 80s and 90s I worked heavy labor for construction outfits around Nome. If you know the region, you'll remember its roots. Nome wasn't just a town. It was the jewel of the gold rush, with skeletons of claims and tailings still scarred across the tundra. Everywhere you turn, history reaches up out of the ground like bones. Some folks find that charming. To me, it always smelled wrong, like the earth out there was still bleeding from men cutting into it for gold. One fall in '89, we were putting in a temporary track for trucking equipment near Anvil Creek. They assigned me and 2 guys to clear brush around an old plot, what locals whispered had been an unofficial cemetery during the rush. Prospectors who froze in their tents, who starved or drank themselves to death, or who swung from gamblers' quarrels. Rough wooden stakes marked some patches, others had sunk into peat. It wasn't on maps, wasn't fenced, but everyone in Nome knew the place. The foreman told us not to worry. We weren't digging graves, just clearing brush. But I've never liked working ground that belonged more to the dead than the living. The first day, it rained heavy. Wind howled against the hills, and the tundra was slick with mud. I set my shovel to scrape brush, but the earth sucked at its blade. That's when my shovel rang against something hard, something that wasn't stone. Brushing away mud, I found wood planks, half rotten. Coffin boards. Too shallow for a real burial, but not surprising, given how desperate rush burials often were. The other men laughed, made dumb jokes, but I dropped my shovel and backed off, because the plank had been pushed outward. Warped by pressure inside, not rot outside. That night I couldn't settle. I camped not far from the site, and the wind coming off the creek sounded like men moaning. I told myself it was just the gale. Still, I had the creeping certainty that when my shovel split those boards, something opened its eyes in the soil and realized someone was standing above. By the second day, the weather cleared. The foreman demanded we push hard since the land out there wasn't holy ground, just dirt. He didn't believe in ghosts or much of anything outside whiskey. The 3 of us went back into the graveyard with chainsaws and axes to strip the brush. That's when we found more coffins. Not intact, but fragments the ice had forced up. Bones, too, washed half out of shallow pits, teeth grinning like gamblers' dice. This time, none of us laughed. There are things you keep sacred by instinct, even if you're not church-going. We worked quietly after that. No banter, just the sound of blades through willow and alder, until midday, when the first whisper came. At first, I thought it was the foreman calling me. My name, soft, hissing through the branches. But when I looked, he was 30 yards off with his back to me, cursing at his chainsaw. Then I heard it. Again, deeper, overlapping, the way a creek burbles, only this was words. Hundreds of them, hushed and angry. The other laborer froze too. He dropped his axe and hissed at me. You hear them, don't you? The whispers swelled in unison, rolling from every patch of ground. Not one voice, but dozens. Shovels scraping, men coughing, gasping. A chorus of greed and agony, echoing from thin soil that had buried them. I won't pretend we were brave. The 3 of us bolted out from that clearing like kids spooked by a firecracker. We stood panting on the bank, swearing. We'd walked into a pocket of wind-funneled weird through the canyon. But when we turned back, the truth shattered that excuse. Every stake, every leaning wooden grave marker was turned, shifted about 30 degrees, all pointing toward us where we stood. No wind on this earth moves posts like that. The foreman barked that we'd better finish or lose our pay. He marched back in, red-faced, yanking his blade into a stump. But he didn't last long inside. Close to evening, he staggered out alone, skin pale, insisting someone had grabbed his boot from the dirt. He wouldn't say what he'd seen, only that tomorrow he wanted nothing more to do with Anvil Creek. That night, I dreamed of coffins banging, lids straining against soil, and when I woke just before dawn, there were wet footprints on the grass between our tents. Bare feet, dozens of them, glistening like they'd walked out of the cemetery straight to us. On the third morning, we didn't return. The foreman called it officially off. Too much dead man's luck for his taste. We packed camp and hauled gear back to a safer staging area down the trail. But safe is a funny word in Alaska. Some things follow you. That evening, we sat tight around a diesel heater when the whispering started again. Not faint this time, not far. It blew right through our tent walls like wind carrying sand. Only now I could make out words. Men fought over gold, argued about whiskey debts. One coughed until his lungs bubbled. Another whispered, "Cold in here. Dig me out." We killed the heater, thinking it hissed, but the voices continued, rising into a frenzy, until it sounded like every forgotten corpse in that graveyard screamed together. The other laborer burst out of the tent into the snow, rocking on his knees. He was pointing, shaking his finger at the slope behind us. I followed his gaze, and my stomach turned to ice. The grave markers from Anvil Creek lined the ridge. Dozens of them. I know damn well we left them planted in the cemetery, but here they'd sunk upright in the frost, every single one leaning toward our camp. No men around them, just crooked timbers marking the fact we'd been seen. The three of us left Nome that week. Contracts be damned. We never collected pay. I took the first job back in Anchorage I could find and never set foot near that graveyard again. But here's what hasn't left me. There are nights, even now, 40 years later, when I wake to hear chains rattling on the floor. Or I'll step outside and find mud where no rain has fallen, smelling of sour earth turned by fresh shovels. Most folks think miners fought bears and weather. Truth is, what killed more of them was their own greed and desperation. They died shallow, unloved, unprayed for, and shallow burials don't keep quiet forever. Anvil Creek still holds its miners. They're bone and mud now, but their voices are sharp. If you trespass, they'll remind you the dirt is theirs first, that some ground never lets you leave without carrying the dead inside you.
My name's Glenn Porter. Back in the late 70s and 80s, I guided canoe trips along stretches of the Yukon River, mostly tourists who wanted their taste of old pioneer trails. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid steady, and it let me stay close to the land. The Yukon isn't a river, it's a moving horizon. Wide enough in spots it feels like paddling across an ocean with current beneath you, about 15 miles off. One of our seasonal stops lies a place guides don't advertise. An overgrown spit of shoreline ringed with moss and alder, littered with rotting timbers and stones stacked oddly against the bank. If you're from around here, you've heard whispers of it, a Klondike-Kira operation where desperate men camped in the late 1890s, when the Yukon ferried gold chasers like cattle up its length. History says half the crew there drowned during spring breakup. The rest simply vanished when their supply boat wrecked. Nobody claims that land now. You won't find it marked. One summer in '84, I was running a group of 5. 4 tourists and my helper, a local kid named Tommy. A storm blew and out of nowhere, whipped the river like a froth. We had no choice but to haul the canoes onto that spit I just told you about. I warned them it wasn't a good place to camp, but you can't argue with panicked city visitors when the rain's blinding and lightning's hitting the water. We dragged the gear between broken-hulled shacks left collapsed in moss and pitch tents, even as we built fire, though I noticed the air felt different dense. Sticky, carrying the stink of river silt, rust, and something sweeter, like rot. The current hissed against the bank like it was whispering, patient and steady beneath thunder, that first night. Long after the tourists fell asleep to the river's lull, I stayed up with Tommy. We watched the shoreline. That's when the humming started. Low, mournful, rising up from the black water itself. Not frogs, not birds' human voices. At first it was single, a baritone note stretched thin. Then more joined in, building into something like hymns sung underwater. The current boiled faintly with no rocks to cause it, and I swear I saw figures bobbing in the river glow, heads just above water, mouths open in song. Tommy grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and hissed, "Those aren't fishers. Those are theirs. The drowned ones." He was right. And they weren't there to entertain, they were there to remind us the camp had never folded. We didn't sleep. By dawn the voices stopped, but the tourists woke refreshed, unaware. Tommy and I barely had words to explain what we saw without sounding insane. So we bottled the fear and told ourselves maybe the storm warped the sound, but the river wasn't done. That evening, while half our group cooked dehydrated stew over fire, I walked to the bank for water. The Yukon moved sluggish, surface strangely glassy. My reflection blinked wrong. It stared longer than I did, mouth still open after mine closed. I gasped and dropped the pot, splashing. But the reflection only grinned wider, teeth pale as driftwood. Then the surface broke not where I leaned, but 20 feet out the shape of a man's head rising slowly. Crowned in dripping hair, eyes sunken black pits, the tourists screamed before I did. 3 more heads bobbed up beside the first, their mouths moving in gasps without breath. Then came the voices, hundreds, layering on each other like a tide, harmonies of agony so heavy the ground itself seemed to hum. We stumbled back to the ruins of the shack. But the river swelled unnaturally quick, as if the current had been waiting. Water rushed over its banks, foaming around snags and stone markers left by the old camp. In it, the shapes rose taller torso, arms, skeletal rib cages clothed in riverweed, still working sluice motions like miners who never quit. They bent, scooping gravel in skeletal fists, tossing nothing into invisible pans. One broke away, pulling itself onto shore. It collapsed, half its body just bones, slick with mud, but it crawled forward, hand dragging deep grooves in the sand. Its jaw gaped and a torrent of river water poured from its throat instead of breath. The tourists tried to run inland, gear forgotten, but the mud clutched their boots as though hands beneath sucked them down. I dug my own feet free only by ripping loose straps. Tommy was cursing, his eyes wide, shouting we had to get back on the river or die here. But the canoes themselves were shifting, dragged toward water by invisible force. It dawned clear as lightning. We weren't camping on a riverbank at all. We were standing in the miner's grave, and the river fed off them daily, keeping their work eternal. The voices swelled, booming now with single words I couldn't mistake. "Stay! Dig! Stay!" In desperation, I grabbed 2 tourists by the arms, dragging them toward the nearest canoe, screaming for Tommy to shove it. He pushed hard against the mud-sucking bank while the drowned tried to climb. Hands clawed the gunnels, nails breaking as they shoved up, jaws spewing water over our gear. One tourist swung his paddle wildly, cracking bone and weed away, but the fragments just dissolved back into water as soon as they hit ground. By pure panic, we got the canoe pushed free, current grabbing it fast. The last sight I remember, burned into my skull, is Tommy's face as another canoe, still on shore with 2 tourists, got dragged straight into the rising flood. Black figures swelled over them like a wave. Their screams cut off as the water sealed them whole, like they hadn't once existed. We shot downstream, paddling harder than ever in my life. The voices followed, rising behind us, traveling miles with the current until finally the flood receded to murmurs. Hours later, silence returned, but 3 lives had been swallowed. Report filed it as a river accident. I let them. How do you tell families their loved ones weren't killed by rapids or hypothermia, but by a choir of old miners who never quit their shift? Tommy never guided again. He left Nome the same year. I kept on a few more seasons, but only far upstream of that cursed bend. To this day, I won't paddle within 10 miles of it. If you ask me why, I'll tell you. I can still hear them sometimes. When I lie in bed, river wind rattling through breaks in the siding, I hear that flat baritone hum, joined by others, like a choir deep beneath the floorboards. They don't want worship. They don't want rescue. They want company more bodies to swell their ranks. To them, we're not visitors. We're recruits. So heed me well. Never let the river lure you onto that spit of land near Anvil Creek. If you see figures moving in water where no ripple exists, if you hear hymn tones without singers, pack up and leave before nightfall, because Alaska keeps her miners. And when the river sings, it sings for more than memory. It sings for you. Name's Daniel Keating. I've worked freight up and down the southeast Alaskan coast for the better part of 3 decades. Lots of time spent near Skagway. Most folks know the name because of cruise liners and tourists these days, but before the souvenir shops and t-shirt stands, Skagway was the heart of the gold rush. Gateway to the Klondike. Every man chasing fortune had to file through White Pass or Chilkoot Pass, and what they left behind along those trails still lingers. Back in 1996, I got asked by a buddy to help haul some gear up toward an old trapper's line near the White Pass Trail. He promised we could shave time by using a forgotten spur, a shortcut along terrain most tourists avoided, since it collapsed to mudslides decades ago. He wasn't wrong, it was faster. But faster doesn't always mean safer. Even before sundown, I felt the weight of the trail. Dense trees pressed overhead, blocking most light, and the fog climbed out of ravines like pale smoke. About 2 miles in, we found what shouldn't have been there at all, a cabin. Half hidden by alder and moss, its timbers warped gray, roof sagging but not yet fallen. Gold Rush era by its bones, old as sin. My buddy wanted to camp inside. Said it'd keep us dry if rain moved in. I flat refused then till he reminded me a tent on soaked tundra meant no sleep all night. Reluctantly, I helped him haul our gear inside, brushing cobwebs from the frame, every inch stank of mildew and rot. But underneath was something worse, metallic, sharp. The air tasted of coin. The fireplace still held blackened stone, as though a fire had burned yesterday, though the chimney was caked in growth. On one wall, hammered nails had once held coats, but now strips of decayed leather hung like molted skins. Something about it drained me just standing there. Like the room knew exactly who we were, trespassers, intruders. Still, we rolled out bedrolls by the hearth. By midnight, the fog pressed against the windows in sheets. The rain came steady. That's when I woke with the taste of ashes in my mouth. I wasn't near the cold fireplace. So where were they coming from? Then I heard it, boots pacing on warped wood just above us, but the cabin had no second floor. I froze, listening. The weight of boots thumped slow heel, toe back and forth overhead where no ceiling should exist. My buddy stirred, eyes blinking in the pitch, whispering, "You hear that?" Before I could answer, a trickle of dirt sifted down from the log rafters above, landing on my sleeve. Instinct made me shove him quiet. The sound grew louder, joined by the drag of something metallic, chains maybe, or a pickaxe scraped across unseen stone. Then, chilling me to marrow, came a cough. Dry, wheezing, the kind I'd heard from men with lungs filled with coal dust. But this was deeper, rattling, endless. I lit the lantern. Shadows flared against the walls, but they weren't ours. Figures moved across the boards, half transparent, as though miners stood all around. One leaned low over us from the false ceiling, a face warped with frostbite, cheeks hollow, mouth wide and whispering. Only when I leaned close did I realize his lips weren't whispering at all. They were grinding his teeth, chewing dust that wasn't there. The cabin groaned with each phantom step. Then, from the fireplace, another shape emerged, sliding from the stone as though smoke solidified. His arms shoveled invisible gravel into his chest, his sockets glowing faint gold. He looked straight through my buddy and then at me. "Where's the gold?" He rasped like gravel dragged dry. My tongue stuck to my mouth. My buddy swore, grabbed the lantern, and shook it like that could drive them back. Instead, the firelight fed them. Shadows thickened, grew solid, miners stepping in circles, 5 of them now. Each with skeletal faces, missing jawbones, smashed skulls but swinging arms as if still working a pan, still pulling gold from dirt. One reeled forward, smashing its pickaxe into the cabin floor, inches from my roll. Splinters flew into my face, the air itself went toxic metallic. Coppery, like a stream of pennies pressed against my entire body. I coughed until my throat bled. My buddy screamed, swore they were pulling nails from the walls. The sound of iron squealing loose filling our ears, and beneath it all, one word repeated again and again, whispered by each ruined mouth in unison. More! We bolted for the door, but when I yanked it open, nothing waited outside but black. Not night. Not fog. Black, absolute, like the cabin now floated in void. When I stuck my lantern out the threshold, its flame bent backwards, sucked into the room. No escape. No trail. No white pass, just this cabin filled with miners who wouldn't quit death. They circled us. Slower now, deliberate, as if savoring panic. Faces melted into one another. Eyeless sockets glistened with greed. One opened his fist, and gold dust poured from his skin onto the floorboards. Tiny grains shimmered and moved by themselves, crawling toward our boots, sticking to our solace, creeping up our legs like insects made of light. We clawed at our pants, desperate to shake it off. The dust clung worse than mud. It burned, hot as ember coals, searing my skin where it touched. My buddy shrieked, his legs glowing gold at the veins. His scream cut short when one miner pressed a bony hand over his mouth and pulled. The gold dust leapt from my buddy into the figure, swallowed greedily into the phantom's ruined chest. I tried to drag him, but the moment I touched his arm, cold rushed into me so hard my head snapped back. I saw it clearly with eyes wide open, the gold rush's brutal history. Men staggering in droves, driven like cattle into these mountains, dying in the mud with curses on their lips and greed overflowing in their souls. That greed never left, never stopped. The cabin had built itself from it. I swung the lantern hard, smashing it against the logs. Oil splattered. Fire flared. The figures hissed, their voices braiding into shrieks as gold dust burned into the floor. The void outside dissolved, wind crashed in, rain returned. I grabbed my buddy limp, still holding breath, and dragged him out. We crashed into mud. Turned once to see the cabin swallowed in flame, miners thrashing inside like silhouettes against hellfire. Then the storm killed it all, one gust, one wash of rain. And when we blinked, the cabin was gone. Just sodden brush, no ruin, no foundation, no sign anything had ever stood there. We staggered miles back to trail in silence. My buddy never spoke of it again. He moved south, away from Alaska forever. As for me, if you ask why I avoid shortcuts through White Pass, I'll tell you true. If you stumble on a cabin where none should stand, don't go inside. Because some shelters hold the dead miners still grinding, digging, burning for more, even in death. Some men never leave the trail.
My name is Charles Chuck Hanlon. I'm not superstitious by nature, though I used to laugh at the tourist ghost stories people toss around in Dawson or Chicken. Ghosts were for brochures, not for people like me. I'm a mechanic, a practical man, run freight sometimes along the Taylor Highway. Or at least, I was a practical man before I stumbled into that old saloon. It was 1992. I'd been running supply cargo north out of Talk when the axle on one truck tore near twilight. No radio reception, miles from the nearest roadside, and a storm rolling black over the horizon. My only option was to walk into the surrounding ghost stretch and pray for cover. That's when I found it. An abandoned gold rush town nobody mapped anymore. Just a huddle of collapsed structures, skeletal beams, and rotted storefronts leaning into each other like drunks. The strangest part? One building at the end of the dirt lane still glowed with lamplight. Warm, golden light spilling from shutters and swinging doors. At first, I thought maybe squatters lived there, or maybe another stranded traveler set a fire. But the hum rising from inside told me different. It wasn't the wild cackle of squatters. It was music, a piano, ragtime rolling smooth and sharp like it was a Saturday night in 1899. I should have turned, kept walking. Instead, the rain started, drenching me through. Against every instinct, I ducked inside. What I saw froze me cold and warmed me all at once. A saloon alive. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, swilling mugs, talking loud. Women swished in corsets, laughing, dealing cards. Smoke hung thick and whiskey burned the air, and at the piano sat a man with pinched features, throttling keys like his arms were steam-driven. The one detail wrong. I saw rain leak through the roof. No one else seemed to. No one else seemed landed either. The more I looked, the more their outlines rippled, as if they were held together only by lantern smoke and memory. Still, a waiter pressed a glass of whiskey into my numb fingers and said simply, "You finally made it." I took one sip and swore I tasted dirt, copper, old blood. Then, the room roared around me in cheer. I sat shaking at a table while rough men toasted their finds, slamming dice across pitted wood. One prospector leaned toward me, face half-lit, half-cracked shadow. "What's your claim, stranger?" he slurred. His smile revealed teeth that weren't teeth at all, but gravel wedged in bloody gums. I mumbled something about passing through. The laughter that followed had no joy in it. All at once I felt their eyes sharpen, hundreds of pupils drilling me down to bone. The barkeep shuffled by, a barrel-chested phantom with an apron still stained. He slammed down another glass. This one shimmered, strange, bubbling gold like molten sunlight. "How special," he growled. My hand trembled as I touched it. The glass was warm. Steam lifted. And when I glanced into the liquid, I didn't see my reflection. I saw men drowning, faces twisted blue, fists clutching for light. Their mouths opened wide, howling clearly in the drink itself. I shoved the glass away. The barkeep's grin turned slick. Around us, the piano pounded faster. The music twisted, souring until it clanged off key like chains rattling metal bars. Voices grew louder, not celebrating anymore but snarling accusations. "You stole my claim." "You'll pay, thief." "Your blood bought that gold." Men slammed pistols on tables. Cards burst into flame without burning hands. One woman, eyes hollow, whispered in my ear, though I hadn't seen her cross the room. "Dance with me, or dance with the worms." Her hand felt like ice pressing into my chest. I staggered up, voice cracking. "I don't belong here." That broke them. The laughter stopped. Silence dragged the room taut. Every blurred figure turned in unison, lantern light making their jaws glow in skeletal echoes. The barkeep leaned closer across the bar, his eyes pits filled with swirling dust, and muttered a sentence I'll carry to my grave. "Everyone belongs here." Sooner or later. Then came the sound of dozens of boots scraping floorboards. They rose as one, fists pounding the tabletops with thunder. Dust filled my throat until I gagged. The saloon doors slammed shut without a hand on them. I ran, choking, desperate, slamming through the soundless crowd. Their arms grabbed like ropes. Fingers cold and stiff closed on my jacket, tearing fabric but not clawing flesh, more like clamps determined to drag me down into their shiftless eternity. Every face lit like wax melting slow. I crashed shoulder first into the batwings of the saloon, expecting open night, and instead burst through into pure black. No storm, no stars, just void. Behind me the piano rang, laughter swooped, and I realized I was trapped. But then, faint, a spotlight cut in from above. Rain, the sound of real rain. The void shredded into curtains of downpour. The ground appeared beneath my boots. Mud, stones, the ruins of a collapsed town too dead to hold any music. I stumbled half a mile before daring to look back. The saloon was gone. The entire street was empty ruins again, sagging timbers wet and lightless. Not a single sound but thunder rolling. When morning came, I trudged back to my wrecked truck along the trail. Took me 2 days to get rescued, and when I told the repair crew what road I'd wandered off on, one older man spat. "You didn't go far enough to see the old King's saloon, did you?" Everything in me locked. I managed to croak out, "What is that?" He just shook his head. "They say it still drinks men who come alone in storm. Claim jumpers, drifters, outsiders, the ones the rush chewed up first. If you made it back, you're lucky. The ones don't. They serve forever. I've never had a sip of whiskey since that night. The smell turns my stomach because sometimes it ain't oak or peat I smell in the glass. It's dirt, copper, screams, And when those Skagway tours talk about ghost saloons with flashing lights and plastic bones, I walk out fast. Because I've already spent a night inside a saloon that never closed. Its doors aren't locked and its patrons are waiting. And one drink is all it takes. If you're smart, you'll remember this. Not every lamp in the ruins should be trusted. Some lights still burn for the wrong reasons. And if you wander in, thinking you found warmth on a bad night, you'll discover too late that you've been invited to the only party that never ends. My name is Patrick O'Rourke. I spent most of my adult life in Fairbanks as a maintenance worker for the university. But in my younger days, back in the 1980s, I had a streak of curiosity that tended to get me in trouble. I liked poking around abandoned structures, especially old gold rush ruins out in the bush. It didn't matter if it was a shack, a broken dredge, or a rotting warehouse. Anything with the smell of history. I never thought I'd scare myself half senseless while chasing that curiosity, but I did. One summer in '86, a buddy tipped me off about a half-standing building out past Circle. It was supposedly an assay office, where prospectors could bring their gold to be weighed, appraised, and made official before heading south. Sounded harmless enough. The rush had ended almost a century back, but rumor had it this place never officially burned or collapsed. It just sagged into itself and refused to leave the map. He wasn't alone. 2 guys came with me, friends, both bush pilots grounded due to bad weather. We reached the spot in the heat of July. The building squatted in the scrub like an old man. Bow-backed roof, boards gray and split, timbers leaning on one another. Across the threshold, the lettering still faintly read, Assay and Office, 1899. Inside, the air was thick, hot, like it had been sealed 100 years without release. Dust swirled in every shaft of light cutting through cracked shutters. The room stretched long, lined with rotted counters and shelves. A massive iron safe stood in the corner, its door ajar, filled with only cobwebs. And on one wall, a chalkboard still bore streaks of faded numbers, sums, and names. Men who had once walked in wild-eyed, fists clenched around little sacks of glittering dirt. Creepy, one of the pilots muttered. History, I corrected. But even then, I noticed it. The silence was too deep. Forests outside are alive with insects, birds, creeks. Here, their sounds stayed back, like the building repelled life. We poked around, taking photos, thumbing old ledgers. That's when my boot scuffed something. I bent down. It was a gold coin, dulled but unmistakable. I held it in the light, too perfect to have sat exposed in dirt for decades. Before any of us could speculate, a sound carried through the stale air. Clink, not from my coin, from deeper inside the office. A second, fainter clink like another coin had just been dropped on wood. Then again. Again. Dozens of coins, jangling, pouring invisible, though the counters stood bare. We froze, breath locked, listening to that impossible rain of treasure. I forced myself toward the sound, dragging courage by its throat. As I neared the back counter, my chest tightened. Shadows thickened as though lanterns burned, though we carried no flame but flashlights. And then, voices. Low men's voices, muttering, bargaining, desperate. A phrase sharpened. Not enough. Never enough. Then another. It's short wait, short wait. The counter shuddered. The ledger pages flapped though there was no wind. I blinked, and for one impossible second I swear I saw them. The clerks. The assayers. Men in sleeves rolled and ink-stained hands standing behind the counter, but their faces were ruined hollows, jaws split in endless curses. On the customer's side, prospectors hunched forward with sacks, slamming them down, bones clattering beneath skin as they demanded their payout. Gold dust sifted from torn pockets into cracks between floorboards, glowing faint in the dim. My friends backed toward the entrance as I stood alone with this mob only half seen. Then the chalkboard scratched itself. We all heard the squeal of chalk across slate. New names scrawled, crooked, belonging to no man I knew. But halfway down, my heart stopped. It was my name. Scrawled in fresh strokes, the clinks rose to a storm. It felt like 1,000 coins rained around us, though nothing hit the ground. My pilot buddy screamed, swatting the air, swearing coins struck his face, His arms left lines and welts. I saw nothing touch him, but blood appeared in thin scratches down his cheek as if metal edges had raked skin. "Out!" I finally shouted, ramming into them, shoving them toward the door. But when we shoved the frame, it wouldn't budge. The wood held fast, nailed by unseen force. Behind us, the specter of a clerk croaked, "Next!" The entire room tilted forward, gravity itself dragging us back to the counter like we were sacks of ore ready for weighing. Dear is a hard engine to stop once it's lit. I grabbed a rusted fire iron from the hearth at the back, swinging wildly at the chalkboard, erasing my name in a smear of dust. The voices erupted into shrieks as the script scoured away. The temperature plunged. Breath steamed from our mouths though it had been July seconds before. The office contorted around us. Ledger books exploded into paper storms. The iron safe slammed shut with a clang, shaking my teeth. The counter bled black dust, pouring like sand. Then came the final horror. Hands. Dozens of them, gray, clawed, thrusting up from the cracks in the floor. They seized my boots, my calves, yanking me down. I fought, screaming, but their grip was vice. My friends pulled, hauling me backward by the shoulders as my feet sank half through timber. Beneath, I glimpsed endless tunnels filled with gold sparks. Miners' souls bent double, shoveling dust for eternity, their faces raw with greed. By sheer luck, the wood gave. My friends ripped me out. We hurled ourselves against the door a last time and it flung open with explosive force, pitching us out into daylight. Silence. Birds. Wind. The assay office stood behind, dark again, lightless. No chanting. No clink of coins, but I'd lost a boot. When I picked it up, my guts twisted. Wedged in the sole, pressed hard like it had been melted there, was a coin. Yet instead of an eagle or liberty stamped on it, the face bore my own profile. Eyes hollow, mouth open in a scream. We left Circle the next day, never went back. My name vanished from the chalkboard in my mind, but sometimes, nights when insomnia has me staring at the ceiling fan, I'll hear it. The faint clink. Clink. Clink of coins counting themselves in the dark. I know the truth now. Those walls still hunger for names, weights, and souls. Men thought they left the gold dust behind on benches and counters, but those assay rooms absorbed more than dust. They kept the greed. They kept the dead. If you're foolish enough to step inside one, never touch the ledgers, never hold the coins, and whatever you do, don't let them write your name on the board. That's when the office decides the account isn't closed. That's when the counting never stops.